Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Building Learning Superpowers Through Reflection. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant here at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. So as you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you are dialing in from in the chat. We always love to connect. And second, we are going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event. So please make sure to submit your questions for us in that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to get to as many as possible. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, BMO, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. And so before we get started, we always like to launch just a couple polls to step back, see how everyone in the room is doing today. This first one is going to ask you, how are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? And I'll give it a couple moments here for folks to submit a response. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Give it one more moment. Gonna go ahead and end this poll now and share these results. All right. Looks like optimism in the lead. Always love to see that, but definitely have some feelings of surviving and anxiety. I'm super confident our conversation today might help, you take action towards some of those feelings. So gonna stop sharing this poll and launch the second one, which asks, what is keeping you up at night? Finance, sales, marketing, scale, pivot, team, or surviving? And this one just helps us understand your current needs as an entrepreneur so we can make sure we continue to create relevant programs and resources and opportunities for all of you. Awesome. Looks like we got folks from Ohio, California, Georgia, Virginia, Arizona, Mississippi, Texas. Awesome. Illinois. Welcome, welcome. Alabama, Pennsylvania, Florida, Maryland. So great to have everyone here all across the world, the country. So awesome. All right, I'll give it just a couple moments. We got folks from India. Awesome. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. All right. Okay, looks like finance, sales coming up in the lead, neck and neck, and then we got needs all across the board as well. So thank you all for participating, super helpful. Gonna stop sharing this poll. And without any further delay, would love to introduce our amazing special guest, Leticia Britos Cavagnaro, adjunct professor at Stanford D School and author of the new book, Experiments in Reflection. Leticia, it is so exciting to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle, and it's really a great pleasure and really energizing to start my day in conversation with entrepreneurs, my favorite people.
Love it. Awesome. So, before we jump right in, could you maybe give just like 30 seconds on who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a scientist and designer. So as you mentioned, I work at the Stanford D School. there. I do many different things, but one thread that connects all of the things that I do is exploring and experimenting on the futures of learning and how we learn. So that's basically what I do. Formally, I also co-direct our program that works with universities across the globe, University Innovation Fellows, the Teaching and Learning Studio. I also teach in the Masters of Design for our Stanford students. But yeah, learning futures, that's what, excites me and keeps me motivated.
Love it. Awesome. So, your book, your guide, it's called Experiments in Reflection. To kick us off, can you start by, just sharing your perspective on the meaning of reflection? What does that word mean to you?
Yeah. Before I get to my answer, which the book explores in depth, but in an actionable way, I'm curious to hear from the folks who are joining us today. So if you can in the chat, what comes to mind when you hear reflection? So just a few words. It doesn't have to be a formal definition. What comes to mind when you think about reflection? And let's see what we get. So Jason is saying like time out, looking back, contemplate, self-awareness and growth, internal dialogue, allowing inspiration to flow. Wow, these are really beautiful ways of expressing that. A moment of peace, mindful thought, self-evaluation, growth, something went wrong, right? Great, thank you for sharing all of those. Let's give a few more seconds for folks to share. Hindsight is 2020, yeah. So as we can see just from the chat, right, like reflection is one of these words, Marvin Minsky calls them suitcase words, right? Like unless we really unpack it, we might be talking about very different things, but we think it's like, oh yeah, reflection, right? Like we all know what it is. So in the book, I really explore reflection in terms of like really helping us learn and supercharging our full brain learning powers. And this is based on the science of how we learn. And I look at reflection in three dimensions, right? And this sort of counters some of the misconceptions, or I wouldn't say misconceptions, but like limiting views that we have of reflection, right? So one of those dimensions of reflection that I think is important is noticing, reflection as a tool for awareness. And this came up in some of the answers in the chat, right? Like kind of like noticing, what's out there, right? Like notice details about the world that surrounds us, but also looking in and notice things about yourself. The second dimension of reflection is to make sense, make meaning out of what you notice, right? So going really digging beneath the surface of what's obvious, right? And the third dimension is to envision, and this is one that is maybe the most counterintuitive, because as some of the folks here mentioned, like we often associate reflection with looking back, right? Like something happened, and even like in some cases, like something bad happened, right? Like, and we need to look back at it. But I think we not only need to look at reflection as looking forward and towards the future, but we must do that. It's important, right? Like, and we can expand on that as we go on with the conversation. So noticing, making sense, and envision are three dimensions that we can use to expand what reflection means, and more importantly, how it can help us achieve our goals.
Love that. And yeah, totally great to, just emphasize like, yeah, we do have all, different perspectives on what reflection means. And, for the purposes of like this conversation, like kind of agreeing upon one definition is really great in terms of, implementing action going forward and changes in the way you're kind of thinking about things in life. And so considering all of that, how does reflection then kind of play into entrepreneurship? Why is it so essential, particularly in those really early stages of business, to incorporate this type of practice into your daily life as a business leader?
Yeah, yeah. I think that often we have this idea that there is this trade-off between kind of like what we need to do, kind of like our pressing daily responsibilities, or kind of like the things that you need to nail, like it might be fundraising, it might be kind of like marketing to kind of like build your business, and kind of like that need to happen now, and taking the time to reflect. So it feels like, you can't afford, I don't have time for that, right? But I would say that it's actually essential to pause and reflect, because otherwise we risk moving and acting in autopilot and missing signals that might tell us something is important, and missing opportunities, which is key for entrepreneurs, right? It's all about like noticing those opportunities and acting on them, right? But here's the thing, pausing to reflect doesn't have to take long, right? Like it doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm stopping and writing in my journal for 30 minutes, right? It could be just a couple of minutes. It might be all you need, right? What's important is the intentionality, the depth, and the consistency, right, in which you do that. In terms of depth, that's where the 3 dimensions that I talked about just now, that I expand in the book, is where I'm hoping that the book can really help you, right, really develop. And in terms of consistency, it's really about developing a habit of reflection in a way that works for you and works for your purpose and works for your routines. In the book, I use the metaphor from like borrowing from Harry Potter and from Jenny Moon, a scholar in reflection, of the pensieve, right? Like, and Dumbledore would tell Harry, there is this pensieve, and you kind of like pour your thoughts into it, and then you kind of like can make sense of them. So it's kind of like creating your own container for reflection. But let me show you, I have my document camera here, so I'm just gonna change to my document camera, and kind of like, and maybe like if you in the audience wants to follow along and create your own, if you have your notebook or a piece of paper, maybe you can we can build a reflection container, a pensieve for yourself, and follow along. So yeah, and this is the book, and as you can see, kind of like very intentionally, there's some reflection in the cover. But anyway, so there's if you can think of this, I'm gonna share with you kind of like 4 building blocks to think about how you incorporate reflection as a habit and something that is sustainable for you and that it adds value, right? So the first element, or the first building block, is the moment, thinking about when you are going to reflect, right? And again, this has something to have to be something that works for you, right? And oftentimes we think as like, oh, reflection happens at the end of things, right? Like after a meeting, or Friday evening, or like, right, like, but let's, you can also reflect, at the start of the day. So I might say like, I'm going to take, Monday mornings, I'm going to take kind of like 5 minutes to reflect as I, kind of like drink my tea, right? Like that's going to be my moment. So then the other thing is like medium, like where and how, what are you going to use for that? One thing, and there's, again, this has something to have to work with you, right? Like, so you can use a physical, medium, or you can use a digital medium. I love kind of like, one of my many ways of kind of like capturing my reflections is to use kind of like small pocket notebooks that I know I can kind of like carry everywhere. So I'm going to say my, pocket notebook. And then, thinking about the prompt, what is going to kind of like, what is something that I can use to kind of like launch and respond to and create my reflection, right? So, and there's many, I'm gonna just share one here. What about, for instance, I'm gonna use this notebook, and I'm gonna just like, I said, like, I'm gonna have 5 minutes, right? Like, so I'm gonna have, let me try something different. I'm gonna do it like this. I'm gonna do in the morning, in those 5 minutes, Monday morning, I'm going to set an intention for the day. So I'm gonna say intention for today. And I'm going to sort of like reflect and say, like, what do I want to achieve today? And sort of like take 5 minutes to jot down some notes there. But now, like, I can also say like, well, in the evening, I'm going to add a gratitude. Okay, something that I'm grateful that happened. So now I can add here. I'm gonna do Monday AM 5 minutes, and then I'm going to do maybe kind of like Monday PM, or it could be Friday, 5 minutes as I turn off my computer, right? Like just before, I'm just gonna come here and jot some notes. So that's the prompt, right? Like, so I created this prompt that has two parts, right? And there's other prompts that you could create. I'm gonna show you here some. So for instance, kind of like thinking about what happened, what does it mean, and what you're gonna do next. That could be a prompt that you use. Or this is one that we use also a lot in giving feedback. I like, I wish, what if, something that you like. Let's say you're reflecting on a meeting. You can think about like something that you liked, something that you wish was different, and what if, and kind of like activating your, reflecting forward. So those are some prompts that you could use. And finally, you could think about the sharing, right? Like, is this something that is just gonna be for me? Or can I kind of like build in some way of kind of like maybe sharing something from my reflection? It doesn't have to be all, but like maybe I take some of the gratitudes from here, and the next day I text someone, right? Like that maybe is associated with this, and share an insight, right? Like, so I might like say, I'm grateful that yesterday you helped me with this project, right? Like, and so I'm also building accountability for myself in completing the reflection. So again, it's kind of like about creating something that works for you.
Love it. Awesome. I think that process, love the way you laid it out. And the examples are great. Definitely something that entrepreneurs can kind of start to think about implementing. And so, in thinking about this process, the other kind of element to this is experimentation. So what is the role of experimentation here, and how does it kind of enhance this reflective process?
Yeah, yeah. So I like to say that for this book in particular, reflection is the what, but experiments are the how, right? And when it comes to experiments, I'm really biased because I'm a scientist by training. So experimenting has always been my MO. But guess what, right? Like, regardless of whether you are a scientist, a career scientist or not, experimenting has always been your MO too. Think about like when we are a baby, right? We try everything, right? Like we put things in our mouth, we throw things, right? Like, and all of those are experiments, right? We're running experiments to see what happens. And some experiments might have to do with physics. It's like, oh, okay, that dropped. That's what happens. But also it's kind of like, oh, that made mom mad or dad, right? Like, interesting, right? Like, so it's experiments at multiple levels. And I think kind of like formal education could do better at keeping that mode of learning and of acting, alive and thriving through all of our lives. And I think kind of like probably entrepreneurs are among those who continue to do that through throughout their lives, and that is great because it's based also on the neuroscience of how we learn, right? But one other thing to mention is that experimenting is really at the core of what entrepreneurship really is, right? You and your audience may be familiar with my colleague Steve Blank's definition of entrepreneurship as the search for a profitable and scalable business model, right? Search for a profitable and scalable business model. The key word is search, right? We don't know. As an entrepreneur, you don't know. So it's not about implementing something that you know works. Of course, you might do that in some of your day-to-day operations, but at the core of your entrepreneurial pursuit is searching for something that works, right? And that's what experiments do, help you figure out what works, right? So it's important to kind of like think about like, what are some questions that you have, and kind of like treat those as hypotheses for your experiment, right? Like, and think about like, okay, I have a hypothesis, I have a hunch, even, right? Like turn it into a question. It's like ask about, like become curious about it and say like, okay, let me figure out like if I'm in the right track, right? Like, so you need to do something. So in the book, I frame each experiment as a hypothesis, a method. So I invite you to kind of like try something, and then a way to interpret your results, right? So I think that's something that we can all do with everything in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And totally agree that experimentation is absolutely inherent to entrepreneurship. And yeah, beyond like the overall kind of, experiment that you're working on with your business, there are all these kind of like micro experiments that you encounter every day in the work that you do. So it's really awesome to recognize that. Um, and so you know, as you kind of mentioned, like this can be a really simple process. It can take a couple minutes. You maybe just need a little notebook or something. How else can entrepreneurs kind of prepare themselves, like set themselves up for success and with this process, as they kind of embark on, think about these questions and begin to embark on these experiments?
Yeah, yeah. I think that what's important there, and you mentioned like small experiments, right? Like not thinking about one term that me and my team, when we work, for instance, with educators trying to innovate in the way that they're teaching, we talk about sneaky little experiments. What is something small that you can do where you don't need a lot of resources, you don't need a lot of permission from someone else, but that is going to allow you to learn something, right? Like so kind of like think about like how to kind of like micro size your experiments. So in terms of thinking about like, okay, I'm gonna do like all of these things, I'm gonna send like 8 emails, and I'm gonna do this, but I need like to get permission to use that mailing list. Is like, okay, what is something that you can do that is gonna give you some initial data that will help you kind of like validate or or not, or create new questions about something that some question that you have, right? Something that you want to figure out. So sneaky little experiments, start small.
Yeah. Love it. Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about like some of the experiments that you include in the book. On one part you kind of discuss the importance of experiments that specifically like amplify the way we experience like the physical world. So can you kind of elaborate on like this idea of using different lenses to direct your attention and how entrepreneurs can kind of be led to unexpected insights through this process of engaging in their physical world?
Yeah, absolutely. And that has to do with the dimension of noticing, right? And like really expanding your awareness. And why don't we just do like, let's do a quick kind of like micro experiment together. So, and I'll do it with you again, with you all. So kind of like look around and find an object, something that is on your desk, on your pocket, your purse, something. Okay, so I have this is kind of like a glasses case, right? Grab that object, and if I tell you, pay attention to the object, what do you do? Maybe you fix your gaze on it, right? You kind of like look intently, right? Probably that's what we have been trained in education, right? Like in school, like sort of like sit forward, like look to the screen or the book, right? And, stop talking, right? But actually, maybe you also turn the object around, right? Like, and that's actually what really paying attention effectively means, right? And there's studies that show this, right? Like, so it's about changing your perspective, your vantage point, right? And it's like turning it around. Maybe like this one has kind of like some kind of like words. So maybe I turn it around and like look upside down. So it's like, I can't really, read what it says. So I start like noticing the lines as lines and not as words that are more symbols, right? Maybe I kind of like close my eyes and I feel the texture, right? Like, which is like, we are often very visual, right? Like, unless we have a visual impairment. So we tend to sort of like predominantly take in things through our eyes, but it's important to also kind of like think about all of our other senses, right? And there seems to be kind of like something activating our sense of hearing, which is great. Some vehicle passing by. So, and so this shift in focus, right, is something that we can do not only, I mean, we just now did it with an object just to kind of like surface those strategies and those different lenses that we can take, but we can do this in our lives, in our interactions with people, in our, pursuit as entrepreneurs, right? Like, so for instance, zooming in and out, right? Like getting really close to the details, or kind of like looking out and looking at the big picture, right? And I think that's really important to kind of like not just get stuck at one level. And that's something that happens often, right? Like, so it's important to get into the habit of kind of like zooming in and out and back in, right? Like, and thinking about like, okay, I need to do all of these details, but wait, why am I doing those? And how is this related to other things that I'm doing, or to other things that others are doing, right? And also recognizing that sometimes when we get like stuck in like the zoom in position in like the details, that can create a lot of stress. I don't know if it happens to you, but sometimes it happens to me, and I have to sort of like zoom out to like see the bigger picture. And that actually like brings me a little bit of like, okay, this is why I'm doing this, right? And it kind of like relieves that stress of like, oh, I have to get this done. The other thing is like changing your vantage point, kind of like, where are you looking at something from? You could think about it as kind of like, well, what is the perspective? This is my perspective. What is the perspective of someone who is, to put it some ways, upstream or downstream in a collaborative process, right? Like someone who maybe is kind of like, up in the hierarchy, or kind of like is making decisions before I have the chance to make decisions, or the perspective of different potential customers, right? Like, so really thinking about those things and being intentional about it. Or, as I mentioned, like turning something upside down, right? So taking your assumptions, the status quo, and reverse it, right? Like, for instance, what if instead of you selling your product to your customers, they sold the product to you, right? Which is like, oh, wait, what? But then it's like, what would they say about it? And think about it from that perspective allows you to unlock a different dimension of, for instance, your product and how your customers are seeing it, right? And finally, like not looking, right? Like using other senses, right? When I was exploring my case, I was kind of like closing my eyes and using touch, right? For instance, at a meeting or an interaction with someone, when you think back at like what happened, or even in the moment, thinking about like, well, they're saying these words, but what is the tone, right? Like, what am I hearing that is not the words? What is their body language? Are they kind of like leaning forward? What is like the, how are they shaking my hand, right? And this brings me to something actually that is, I think it's really important, that has to do with kind of like, oh, I don't have time to reflect, which is that there's one way of looking at reflection that comes from Donald Schoen, who's a scholar of reflection, which is that there's reflection on action and reflection in action. So reflection on action is kind of like thinking, the traditional way of looking at reflection, of like thinking back at like, oh, this just happened, let me reflect on it, versus reflection in action. It's like reflection that is happening in real time as you're experiencing something, right? You can think of reflection in action as like training your intuition, or like honed intuition, right? So you can course correct and make strategic decisions in the moment, right? Like, so really expanding your capacity to reflect allows you to do this. And I can share a recent moment where I became aware of this happening, which is really interesting. As I was recording the audiobook for the audio version for the book. And so I was in a studio, and I kind of like had the book, in front of me. Actually, it was an iPad, but like, you can, so like, right. And I needed to be kind of like, the microphone was here. I needed to be recording. And I realized like there were like a few words every now and then that would like, I would stumble on those words repeatedly, right? And it was like, I would try to like, oh, sorry, take two, blah, 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 and I would like stumble again. And I'm like, and I'm not a native English speaker. That's probably part of it. But then I realized I could have said like, okay, great, that was tough. And then like next time, let me reflect on it. And like next time I record an audiobook, I will do A, B, and Z to improve. But I realized in the moment, right, like that it's like, okay, if I actually, when I realized like, okay, I stumbled onto this word twice, right, and I was like not able to pronounce it correctly, if I actually sort of like look at the word, and the moment I'm about to read the word, I look up and away from the word, I can say it perfectly. And so I would do that. I would kind of like read, and then like the word is coming. Oops. Okay, great. I passed that, right? Like, and I realized that. And so then from that moment on, like I would just stumble once, like, okay, I know what to do, right? Like, so really kind of like adjusting and course correcting in the moment. So reflection in action, training your intuition.
Love that. And I also just love this idea that it's like really about like changing your perspective and like looking at, things from a different angle. Loved the analogy with the object. And I found myself before you even said it, I was turning it around in my hands and I was like, ah. But yeah, I think that's just such a great comparison. And so yeah, I guess kind of like staying on this point for a moment. Something else you kind of talk about in the book is like the importance of knowing yourself, knowing how others see you and the way that these forces kind of come together to shape your decisions and actions. So considering like the investment in kind of understanding these different perspectives, how does this kind of play into market research and even just kind of like your development as a leader?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's really important, right? Like, so it's important to not notice, what's happening out there, but actually turning our gaze toward ourselves. And there's a few key things there. One is certainly our emotions, right? Like emotions, I like to call them the highlighters of learning, right? Because they point at something important happening. So getting attuned to your emotions is really important. In the book, I share an exercise, and actually there's another chapter that, like, because of length constrictions, didn't make the book, that is about kind of like doing that in the context of a team. But even you by yourself, right? Like when you're experiencing something and you're kind of like an emotion, a mood comes up, right? Is important to take that as feedback. It's like, oh, there's something here, but let me understand why. So instead of just reacting, like trying to, when you're reflecting on the event or what on the interaction, like really thinking about like, what did I feel, and then asking yourself why, right? Like, so there's some emotions like, that might be getting in the way of you learning and making progress or collaborating, like, frustration is like, every time I work with this person and I tell them to do this, they don't do it. So like, I'll just do it myself, right? Like, and frustration versus kind of like, how can you reframe that, emotion? Because emotions are actually kind of like, things that we feel in our body, but also the stories that we tell ourselves about that. So it's kind of like, how can we reframe that into kind of like curiosity? It's like, I'm curious about like, why is it that they're not doing this, right? Like, so maybe we understand the task differently, right? Like the work at hand differently, and we need to clarify. So really kind of like treating emotions as feedback about what's important. The other thing is your identity, right? Like looking not only at like kind of like what is, the what you do, but like who you are, who you think you are. And that is something that dynamically changes and is socially constructed as well. And there's no one identity, there's many. So that's something that it's an experiment in the book that actually has a lot of people say like, wow, that was really one experiment that really kind of like hit me, kind of like gave me lots of insights, and which is kind of like exploring your many identities, right? And let me show you a little bit of that. I'm gonna change my camera again and show you from the book. Great, so this is experiment 4, right? Figure who you are really. And it's kind of like, it's at the same time simple, but again, very profound. And it's really looking at, and you can see here, so like the two concentric circles, right? And so kind of like at the in the outer ring, right? There's some, and this is an example with my identities, right? Like some of my identities that are visible and kind of like apparent if you just look at me or you hear me, right? Like you might say like, or because of like, the title that is under my signature, right? Like, so you can tell, right? In the middle, there's some identities that maybe like there might not be apparent or visible, right? Like, but if you really know me, kind of like, I'm a learner, I'm a mentor, I'm a daughter, a friend, a sister, a wife. And then in the center, and of course it's empty here, because there's identities that actually we sort of like try to actively keep away, like, from others. We don't share those, right? Like, so I think kind of like reflecting on all of these is important, because sometimes like some of these identities might get in the way of how we act, or might, like, we might also think about like, well, how are others seeing me, and like what are the implications of that, right? Like, and so this is a really useful thing to reflection to do, and we can think about also how that changes, or how can we also explore that in terms of our customers or potential customers, right? Like sometimes we tend to like kind of like putting them in neat groups by age or function or other demographic indicators, but a lot of the decisions that we make really have to do, are more nuanced, right? Like have to do with our identities and our the way that we see ourselves, right? Like, so kind of like really start to consider that as well.
Love that. Awesome. And thank you for sharing the example, because I think kind of like visualizing like the tears is really helpful in terms of just like understanding yourself and even other people. Um, and so just because we're getting close to that live Q&A, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. You know, in the last few experiments you share in your book, you kind of talk about how reflection reveals every possible future from each decision you could make or action you could take in the present. And so thinking about this, in what ways can entrepreneurs kind of harness these practices, with the intention of creating a future that they really desire, full of purpose and meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I want to clarify something important, right? Like, so it's not really about revealing every possible future, right? Because no one has the crystal ball, right? Like we all wish, right? But it's really about imagining what might happen, right? Like, and in some cases also imagining what we like, things that we would not want it to happen. But it's important to kind of like do this prospecting and reflecting forward, right? Like there's definitely like a whole field of futures thinking and people who are like experts in this, but we all need to think like futurists, right? It's imperative that we do that for ourselves and for for humanity, really. And it really starts with really changing one fundamental belief, right? The idea that there is one future that is kind of like coming our way and happening to us, right? And changing that for like, well, actually there's many possible futures, right? And it all starts with kind of like, I can do something, right? Like, in we can all contribute in different ways to kind of like imagine first, we have to what we haven't imagined won't happen, right? Like, so really kind of like thinking about like what could be possible, and then kind of like, what do I need to do today to steer towards that future and not that future, right? And this is key for entrepreneurs for that reason, right? Like, we can't build what we have not imagined, right? And this is what in the book I call reflecting forward, right? You may have heard one of my favorite quotes, and you may have heard this quote by William Gibson, is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? And futurists talk about signals, right? Like, so what this means in practice is that there might be like trends or behaviors, right, solutions that may exist like in little pockets out in the world, or like, and may kind of like pop up in the news, right? Like, wow, this person, yesterday I was kind of like in a meeting, and someone was sharing a signal about a teenager who in Europe who was like living in trains, like they would live in trains the whole year and spending like 16,000 euros in that, right? Like, so taking those things that make us like do like, interesting, and kind of like, what does it mean? What would it mean if that behavior were to kind of like be adopted more broadly, right? So let me give you a concrete example that has to do with innovation and something that we are all like living, right? For a few months now, so I live in San Francisco, right? Every time now that I have to go somewhere in the city, or often when I have to go somewhere in the city, I call a self-driving car from Waymo, right? And the car drives me, and there's, to wherever I want to go. It was amazing how little time it took for me to get used to that idea immediately, right? Like, it was a novelty for the first 5 minutes. I was with my husband. I was like, ooh, taking videos and kind of like looking at people being kind of like, wow, no one's driving that car. But then immediately it was like, wow, this is completely natural, like, right? Like, and that's a signal from the future, right? Because it's happening in San Francisco and in a few other cities, I believe Phoenix, LA. But so we can take that and reflect forward and imagine what might happen as a result, right? Like, so I know we don't have a lot of time, but let me kind of like, let's do a like sort of like a really quick one, right? Like, so for instance, we can, if we can start, and this is an experiment in the book, right? Like, so if we say people can take self-driving cab, okay, and then we can say like, well, if everyone could do that, what would happen? And so it's like, no need for parking, for instance, right? But then we can say like, well, if there's no need for parking, maybe the city eliminates parking, right? Like, parking spaces go away, right? And then kind of like, okay, when you want to drive your car on a Sunday, right? Like, there's like, where do I park, right? Like, where do I park, right? Like, so there might be implications at that level. But also you could say like, well, if I can be driven by the car, well, I can take a power nap on my ride, right? Like, power nap. And then that may mean that there's less need for caffeine, right? And that might mean that, Starbucks goes out of business. Well, this is, of course, kind of like a big jump, right? Like, but you get the idea. It's about really just logically step by like what could happen, and what, if this was true, what could happen, right? And really, prospecting possibilities for the future.
Love it. Awesome. So, before we jump into live Q&A, I just wanted to touch on one other point that I think is kind of important. I know we have like a lot of impact-driven entrepreneurs in the audience who are always kind of, seeking to better understand their stakeholders' needs and how that will develop in the future. And so can you talk about this concept that you mentioned in the book about being a good ancestor, and how entrepreneurs can kind of shift their mindset to make decisions that contribute to that kind of intergenerational change?
Yeah. I think that's really very important. And I have to say, so this in the book, I cite and I created an experiment. I present an experiment based on the book The Good Ancestor by Roman Krishnarik, which I definitely like recommend you should read it. It's like well-researched, in-depth book about long kind of like long-term thinking, right? Like, and really an intergenerational collaboration. But really it's about like changing our time horizons, right? Like, we tend to think about like, oh, what do I need to do kind of like now, or like, what is our 5-year plan, right? But what if you thought about like, well, what is a project that would take 100 years to complete, right? Like, and you might think like, well, what's the point of asking myself that, because I'm not going to be around, right? But actually that's the point. If you're not going to be around, who can take over from the next generation and generate that chain of intergenerational collaboration that is, I think, essential, right? Like, so I think one, like, things to think about for right now is kind of like, how do we include the next generations in our decision making, in our thinking? So for instance, like, invite a young person to collaborate on a project, right? Like, or on your advisory board. Like, how do you involve the perspective of new generations in your work, and really think about the legacy we want to leave, right? Like, so I in the book I share a little bit about like the Long Now Foundation and their work to really expand kind of like how we think about the future and and what we do. But also this, it really builds on the thinking of indigenous people around the world for a long time. For instance, the seventh generation thinking, right? Like what you do, and decide on what you do based on like, how might this affect 7 generations after me, right? And I think we all need to do this to kind of like really create a better world for everyone.
Love it. Awesome. Leticia, this has been such an awesome conversation, and we do still have a little bit of time for live Q&A. So if you are in the audience, please drop your questions in that Q&A function at the bottom. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Just to kick us off, you shared a few stories from kind of like your experience. I think we have an entrepreneur here, kind of curious about like if you've seen any other use cases or examples, I think specifically like in terms of like business or entrepreneurship where this has kind of been shown to be effective.
I would be curious, Arjun, when you say this is like, is it reflection? Because I think what is important again is kind of like thinking about going like nuance, right? Like going past the like, oh, reflection is just about thinking. But like, that's why in the book I want, like, what I structured in the book is like, here's a collection of experiments that are going to help you go deeper and more nuanced in different dimensions, right? Like in noticing what is around you, inside, notice, and then making sense, kind of like also thinking about multiple ways to interpret something, and then reflecting forward, right? Like envisioning the future. So there's, I think, there's many like ways in which, I mean, I shared like some related to kind of like the envisioning, but really when you think about it is, and this is something I work often, like we teach design to business leaders, to entrepreneurs, to civic innovators. And one thing, for instance, that is important is to really going, beyond like the one interpretation. So in the making sense dimension, for instance, like if you really want to kind of like get in-depth insights, it's really about thinking about like, well, we noticed this. It could be a trend. It could be like, our customers, or like there was this response to this email that we sent, right? Like do multiple interpretations. This might mean this, but this could also mean this. This could also mean this, and then treat that as an experiment. So that's where I think really successful entrepreneurs do, is kind of like, how can you treat your hunches and the data that you collect as hypotheses for continuous experimentation.
Awesome. Love that. And yeah, I think that's kind of like a really great way to um you know, think about it in terms of like actual implementation and taking action on those insights that you gather. So we have another question here. Really asking about and I think you kind of mentioned reflection itself can take just a couple minutes, but I think this person is kind of asking like long term, like how do you kind of how much do you kind of reflect before coming to those conclusions? How do you kind of know when you've reflected enough?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, again, I think it's like, and this is a great question, right? Like, but it's about like, developing that sense of like what is working for you. But like in the book, let me show you this because that's a graph that could be useful. I share a tool that I developed with colleagues that I call the insidometer. So it's kind of like a way to kind of like assess your insights when you kind of like run an experiment, you gather some data, and it's like, okay, what do is this kind of like a good insight, or like how is this helpful, right? Like, so let me go there and show you the insidometer here. So you can see here, right? Like, so kind of like you have your data, your results, and your data might be, quantitative. It might be like this many people, bought this or said that they would, attend the event. Or it could be qualitative. It could be quotes. It could be, things that people said, and then it's important to kind of like develop, and tune your capacity to say, well, did I learn something new, right? Like, so it could be like, okay, no, I did this and this did nothing for me. I didn't uncover anything interesting. And that's fine, right? Like, not all experiments are going to be like, wow, that was like mind blowing, right? But maybe you're kind of like, maybe there is something there. I just need to think more about it. And incubation is key, right? Like, so related to this question, I think kind of like not assuming that everything is going to come to us sort of like as a bolt of lightning, but like sometimes we need to incubate, right? And kind of like let go. And it's kind of like, there's something here. Let me, forget about this and then come back to this. Or maybe you kind of like uncover something new, a new way of thinking about something, right? Like, so you're in like, aha, wow, I had never thought about this. And it might be new to you. And then you discover that others say like, oh yeah, I knew that, or this, look at this other data out in the world. But it's kind of like really important to kind of like develop and kind of like tune your insidometer in terms of like, what are you learning, and kind of like do this assessment.
Love it, and really appreciate like the visual there, because I think it can be helpful to kind of think about, those experiences kind of on a scale and compare over time. And yeah, absolutely. I think that's just a great way to kind of like measure the progress, and simple as well. So to I think we have time for one last question that I think was kind of interesting. What are your thoughts? You talked about kind of like leveraging reflection to better understand ourselves and our stakeholders. What are your thoughts on how this that kind of practice will be influenced with, emerging technologies like AI?
Yeah. And I'm seeing like, Andrea has a great point in her question. It's kind of like how the specific method of the identity circle become very important in the age of AI. And it's like, oh, well, do we have another hour? Because like, I've been doing some work also in developing AI tools, specifically a reflection a tool that teachers can use with their learners. So happy to talk about that. And if there's any educators in the audience, I'm gonna drop the link here in case you want to try the tool. It's a tool that we have developed at the D School, and other tools. So I've been doing a lot of also work with helping teams and individuals understand what is the relationship with AI, right? Like, so in a world where like now we will have like a lot of kind of like agents that can work for, is it like working for us, with us? So are we collaborators? Are we their boss? Are they their interns? Are they our bosses, right? Like, so thinking about like, what are the kind of like labels and metaphors that are helpful to think about when we work with AI and make it work for us? What are the right, kind of like relationship, labels or identities to think about? So yeah, that's an interesting area of exploration for sure.
Awesome. Love it. All right. We are about to run out of time, but if you are in the audience, please drop, if you have one just key takeaway from this session, thing that you'll take home with you today. Drop it in the chat, drop it in our LinkedIn post for the event. We'd love to hear, kind of your learnings from this experience.
Michelle, and I wanted to add, like we added and Anna added there a post on LinkedIn because we thought we would run an experiment, and instead of like gathering your takeaways on the Zoom chat, which no one will see, or if maybe you're watching on YouTube, kind of like use LinkedIn and use the post and your comments to kind of like share your reflections in a more visible way, right? Like, so if you can go to that link there, just like put your takeaways there. What is something that you're taking away? What is a concept that resonated with you? What is something that you're going to try? So that's something that I'm really interested in hearing. It's like, what is one thing that's like, I'm going to try this, right? Like, so please share there. So, yeah.
Awesome. And while we are waiting for people to kind of submit some responses there, would love to hear your key takeaway, just one kind of piece of wisdom that you feel is important to drive home here.
Yeah, yeah. So one word of reassurance that I'm telling myself all the time, it's okay not to know, right? Oftentimes we get kind of like nervous. It's like, oh, I need to know exactly what I'm doing, right? In fact, we need to push ourselves to a place where we don't know, right? Because that's where we're going to get somewhere interesting, something that is, a new to the world idea, right? Like, and so getting to really to that mindset and practice of experimentation to get ourselves in that place of not knowing, to then be able to reach a place of innovation and something of value. So go forth and experiment. That's my advice.
Awesome. And I see we got some folks chiming in the chat, being intentional, changing perspectives. Awesome, being impactful, reflecting on my reflections. Love it. Awesome. Leticia, it has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing just such an awesome overview, the visuals, the analogies. It was just a wonderful experience. So on behalf of the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone here today, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. It was my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for engaging and for being active participants. Yeah, have a great day, great weekend.
Awesome. And to our audience, we would love for you to join us for upcoming webinars, which you can view using that link that's going to be posted in the chat. And thank you all so much for joining us again today. We look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.